Chapter 141, Jun. I will participate in the next battle. Lin Feng's voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for everybody to hear him. Everybody was surprised when looking at Lin Feng. He surprisingly wanted to fight against a 4th Ling-level lizard. He was so young. Those who dared to enter in the cage all considered themselves as very strong cultivators. They were not stupidly playing with their life, but that lizard had already killed 28 people. It meant that it was very powerful and strengthened in battle. A cultivator of the 4th Ling Qi layer who wanted to fight the lizard was taking a huge risk. It would be very difficult to emerge victorious for an average cultivator of the 5th Ling Qi layer. Someone under the 4th Ling Qi layer would never be able to win against it. That is why the reward for them if they won was 100 purity stones of medium quality. Bai Zi smiled when he saw that Lin Feng was standing up. It looked like another military student was going to die in the prisoner arena. What a pity. He's going to die before his battle against He Mo. It's terribly disappointing, said the young man in yellow clothes while laughing. Lin Feng was challenging a lizard. He was definitely going to die. Born as a beggar, he will also die as a beggar for a few purity stones. He dares to risk his life. Not only will he lose his life, but he will also lose the few purity stones that he has. Lin Feng turned around and looked at the young man in yellow clothes in a playful way. The prisoner arena can lend a stage to 2 cultivators who wish to battle to the death. Could it be that you want to have a try against me? Said Lin Feng in a loud voice which echoed throughout the arena. The young man was speaking so loud that a great number of people could hear him, so Lin Feng spoke so loud that everyone in the viewing platform could hear him. The young man was stupefied and was speechless. Are you fighting or not? You keep talking bullshit yet do not have the spine to take action. A piece of trash with a big mouth can also be a coward. What a surprise, said Lin Feng fiercely. The young man in yellow clothes was furious. The sensation that everybody was looking at him with mocking glares made him even more furious. He was evilly staring at Lin Feng. Poor guy, he's so pitiful, said Wen Ao Shui while laughing loudly. It was useless to keep talking to him as he had no backbone, so Lin Feng ignored him again and walked towards the border of the cage, moving close to the old man. The old man opened the door of the cage and let Lin Feng enter. Lin Feng went in and suddenly felt oppressed. It was as if the qi of all the people and creatures in the cage that was oppressing him. The sensation was very uncomfortable. When the lizard saw Lin Feng come in, it roared loudly. Ling-level ferocious beasts were very smart. They knew who their enemies were. It knew that if it didn't kill Lin Feng, it would have to die. The expression within its eyes looked ice-cold. It was slowly and cautiously crawling towards Lin Feng. Lin Feng looked at the lizard move towards him. Lin Feng looked indifferent and calm. He didn't look agitated at all. But suddenly, the gigantic body of the lizard jumped up into the air and flew towards Lin Feng at full speed. It was 1,000 times faster than a moment before when it was crawling. 8 strikes of desolation. Lin Feng used both of his hands to unleash his strikes. Lin Feng had mastered this skill to perfection. With one strike, he could kill a normal cultivator of the 4th Ling Qi layer. Surprisingly, the lizard didn't avoid Lin Feng's attack. It opened its claws and blocked Lin Feng's attack. It managed to weaken the power of Lin Feng's attack. Of course, 8 strikes of desolation were an extremely powerful attack, and it was impossible for that lizard to completely disintegrate its power. A few strikes still managed to pass through and crash into its body, which made it fly backwards. It roared extremely loudly as if it had been angered. However, what surprised Lin Feng is that it wasn't injured at all. As expected, it has a very strong defense. No wonder it has managed to kill 28 cultivators already, thought Lin Feng. It emitted a loud bestial roar. Its eyes grew colder and colder. It was an incredibly horrifying sight to behold. Suddenly, it dashed towards Lin Feng again. Lin Feng didn't use his 8 strikes of desolation. Instead, he released an extremely strong sword qi which created whirlwinds in the air. It seemed like the body of the lizard was being oppressed by the power of the qi. The sharp sword qi made the lizard roar extremely loudly. Its sharp claws were moving towards Lin Feng with deadly precision. If Lin Feng came into contact with these claws, then he would be cut into pieces. At that moment, Lin Feng jumped straight towards the lizard. He had moved into the range of the lizard's strikes. He also slightly raised his hand into the air. What is he doing? He's using his hand to block the claws of the lizard? He's crazy. He's going to die. People in the crowd were making various comments. Most of them were stupefied. Many people got lacerated into pieces by the claws of the lizard after the first attack. Its claws were even sharper than most swords. Lin Feng's hands finally reached the lizard's claws, and suddenly, a radiant white light filled the entire cage. The crowd was astonished. Lin Feng didn't seem to have been injured, but the lizard was screaming and howling in agony. How's that possible? How could his hand be sharper than the lizard's claws? The crowd was astonished. They all looked puzzled. Lin Feng continued moving nearer and nearer to the lizard. Surprisingly, he wanted a close combat battle against the lizard. They were both moving as fast as lightning. Suddenly a trail of brown blood splashed into the air. There was a huge wound on the lizard's body. What a terrifying attack, and he did that with only his hand. He concentrated sword chi into his hand and it became even sharper than a sword, said a cultivator in the crowd. The crowd was astonished. That young man was really a monstrous genius. What many cultivators of the fourth Ling Chi layer had tried in vain before, Lin Feng had done it so easily with his bare hands. When they saw that, Bai Zi and the young man in yellow clothes were both astonished and furious. They hadn't thought that Lin Feng was so strong. Obviously, he hid his strength on the entrance day. Bai Zi felt ridiculous and laughable. He realized how strong Lin Feng was. On that day, he had called him a beggar each time he opened his mouth. At that moment, he realized that Lin Feng was a much stronger cultivator than him. He would never be able to defeat Lin Feng no matter how many resources his family provided him. Lin Feng didn't know what all these people were thinking at that moment though. He just wanted to achieve his victory over the lizard. At that moment, he could concentrate all sword energy into his hand. It wasn't as terrifying as his sword attacks, but it was still extremely strong. Each time Lin Feng's hand touched the lizard, blood was sent splashing around the arena. After a short time, the lizard had already lost a great deal of blood. It gave a horrible shriek. "I'll stop playing with you now," thought Lin Feng. He went even closer to the lizard. Immediately, a gigantic sword chi emerged from his hand, and with a single strike he beheaded the lizard and put it out of its misery. The entire crowd was astonished. "Wow," sighed the crowd in amazement and thought, "How strong. He just used his hand as a sword. You win. Here are 20 purity stones of medium quality," said the old man entering the cage while handing Lin Feng the purity stones. Lin Feng impolitely took the stones and left the cage without sparing a glance at the old man. Lin Feng glanced to the side where the cultivation slaves were fighting. This time, another cultivation slave had been killed. The two sides were separated by an iron gate. If it was opened, the slaves and the beasts would be together in a single area. When Lin Feng came out from inside of the cage, he felt much better, as inside it was a very oppressing atmosphere. Lin Feng moved back towards his seat, glanced at the young man in yellow clothes with a mocking look, and then sat down. On both sides of the cage, two old men were bringing in a new ferocious beast and a new slave. The slave's hair was so messy that his facial features were almost invisible. He had handcuffs on his hands and chains at his feet which made a loud metallic noise after each step he took. Suddenly, the slave raised his head, and his face became visible. There was a word on his face: Jun. End of chapter 141. Chapter 142, Insane Fury. The word covered his entire face, which made it difficult to see his real facial features. His entire appearance made him look extremely savage and hideous. Besides, his two dark eyes made him look even more cruel. His expression was enough to make anyone shiver. "How cold," said the crowd. They were all shivering. Cultivation slaves were fighting every day all day. They were extremely strong and battle-hardened warriors. Therefore, each time a cultivation slave came from the prisoner arena, there would always be fights between those who wanted to buy the slave. Lin Feng frowned. What a cruel method. He didn't know where these slaves came from, but marking their face was going too far. It completely violated their human rights and made them nothing more but animals. They would never be able to live in the real world. They were doomed to living in that hell forever. That slave is of the third Ling Chi layer. He has already won 16 battles. If somebody wins against him, he can receive 20 purity stones if he's above the third Ling Chi layer, 100 if he's of the third Ling Chi layer or lower, said the old man leading him into the cage. The whole crowd was stupefied. He had won 12 battles less than the lizard, but had won against all his challengers. He was incredibly terrifying of an opponent. Bai Zi, third Ling Chi layer, he is the same level as you, said the young man in yellow clothes. Bai Zi was surprised. He immediately nodded and said, "I'm going." "All right," said the young man in yellow clothes while smiling. Bai Zi walked towards the edge of the cage near the old man who was inside. Bai Zi nodded to him. The old man looked at Bai Zi and frowned. He then said, "This slave is extremely strong. Are you sure that you want to go into the cage? I'm sure, said Bai Zi while nodding without hesitation. The old man thus let Bai Zi enter the cage. Groaned Wen Ao Shui from on the bleachers to show his discontent. Lin Feng was also surprised. Surprisingly, they had warned Bai Zi that it was a dangerous battle. When he wanted to fight against the lizard, the old man hadn't said anything even though the lizard was extremely strong. Lin Feng, that slave is out of luck, said Wen Ao Shui. Lin Feng looked at him in a strange way and asked, That's weird because I know how strong Bai Zi is and he doesn't have exceptional strength, nothing special. I even get the feeling that he could lose this battle before it even begins. Bai Zi could never lose. Do you know who is in charge of the prisoner arena? Asked Wen Ao Shui. Lin Feng was surprised and looking at Wen Ao Shui with big eyes. The Bai clan is in charge of the prisoner arena. Everything here is controlled by his clan, said Wen Ao Shui indifferently. Lin Feng was stunned. No wonder that the old man was warning Bai Zi, because it was his clan that run the arena. What if Bai Zi loses? They only look at the process, not at the result, said Wen Ao Shui mysteriously, who seemed to understand what was going on in the background. At that moment, Bai Zi was facing the slave within the fighting stage of the cage. A strong and sharp qi emerged within the atmosphere. Bai Zi shivered when he saw the bestial expression in the slave's eyes. Die! Shouted the cultivation slave. He then immediately threw himself at Bai Zi. Everybody who entered the cage wanted to kill him. If he did not kill the people who entered the cage, then they would try to kill him. The chains that he was wearing suddenly emitted a whistling sound in the air. The slave was jumping towards Bai Zi looking like a deadly spear. Hurricane spirit, whispered Lin Feng when saw that a hurricane spirit had appeared behind Bai Zi's body. Bai Zi was extremely arrogant and thought that he was a true genius, but Lin Feng had required only one finger to defeat him. He hadn't even had the time to release his spirit. He had been humiliated to the extreme. But Bai Zi was only 18. In any other place, he would be considered as a genius. In the Yun Hai sect, it would have been no exception. However, in the imperial city, there were many young cultivators who were much stronger than him. Genius was a very relative word in that context. The slave didn't even look at Bai Zi. His chains were still lacerating the atmosphere and diffusing whistling sounds as they cut the very air itself. How ferocious, thought Bai Zi, who started shaking and retreating a few steps backwards. At that moment, a vine illusion had started twining around Bai Zi's body. The slave was still flying towards Bai Zi like a spear rushing through the air. There was absolutely no superfluous movement made by the slave, he was going directly for the kill. Bai Zi was in a fatal position. Bai Zi's pupils shrank. He struggled to move his hands and suddenly a strong qi flowed from his body which looked like a hurricane and moved towards the slave's chains at full speed. Suddenly, Bai Zi was almost suffocating because the slave had put even more strength into his vine illusion which was twining around Bai Zi's body. The slave, with the aid of his vine spirit, had managed to control his flight through the air and his trajectory looked like a perfect arch within the air. He was moving straight towards Bai Zi. How strong! The crowd was amazed at the sight. The slave was extremely strong. Every single move he made was perfect. He was fast, agile and experienced in battle. Lin Feng frowned. He remembered that he had already seen that kind of spirit. Han Man's friend, Po Jun, had a vine spirit too. Po Jun and Jun the slave. Lin Feng looked surprised. He was staring at that slave as if he had understood something terrifying. Was it a coincidence? How could they have the same name and use the same spirit? Boom! While Bai Zi was doing his best to avoid the attack, the slave finally reached him and sent him flying backwards. However, he was not injured. The slave was stupefied. He had carried out a very strong attack but hadn't managed to kill his opponent. How could he have not died from that attack? Stop! At that moment, a loud voice emerged in the atmosphere. The slave was surprised, stopped moving and stared at the old man. This battle ends here, said the old man indifferently. The crowd was stupefied. End of the battle? Only death could make a battle end, those were the rules. How could it just end during this fight? It looks like the old man and the current challenger have a relationship, thought the crowd, especially when they remembered that the old man had warned Bai Zi. That was the only possibility. We're not done yet, how could the battle end here? Asked the slave with a husky voice. He was fixedly staring at the old man. The old man's expression suddenly became evil. A slave dared refute his words? Since you want to die, I will help you achieve your aim, said the old man with an evil smile on his face. Release the beast. When the old man finished talking, on the other side of the arena, a middle-aged man appeared. The crowd was surprised by the fact of what he was riding as a beast-like monster. It had 4 legs and chains around its neck. Jun, this is the fiercest of beasts, and while you are in its presence you would do best to act docile. Today, you will fight against it. If you win, you will live; if you lose, you will die," said the old man evilly. Jun was fixedly staring at him. Surprisingly, he wanted him to fight against it. That old man was an animal. When the beast heard these words, it raised its head and bestially looked at the old man. When looking at the situation, Lin Feng, who was sat on the viewing platform, started to release an extremely strong and cold qi. End of chapter 142. Chapter 143, Brothers. That strong freezing qi seemed like it was coming from the depth of the earth itself. Wen Ao Shui, who was sitting next to Lin Feng, was extremely surprised. A strange expression appeared on his face and he looked at Lin Feng. "How cold?" said Wen Ao Shui while looking at Lin Feng with his beautiful woman-like eyes. Why was Lin Feng's body releasing so much cold qi? Not only Wen Ao Shui was surprised but the others as well. Lu Fei, Jing Yun, Duan Feng and Yuan Shan were all staring at Lin Feng. They could all feel the cold qi that he was releasing on their skin. The moment the qi had reached them they were freezing cold. Only Jing Yun glanced at Lin Feng for a second and then looked at the monster again. She looked at the legs of the beast. Its legs were tied with chains, but it seemed like its forelegs were actually hands, human hands. Similarly, to cultivation slaves, it had a mark on its face. Han was written across its face. Jing Yun got the feeling of déjà vu. She started to look closely at the beast and saw that it looked almost human. "Han man," said Jing Yun. She couldn't believe her eyes. She didn't believe what she was seeing. That beast couldn't be Han man. But in view of the cold qi coming from Lin Feng's body, Jing Yun thought that she must have been right with her assumption. That couldn't possibly be anybody else. An expression full of hatred and wrath suddenly appeared on Jing Yun's face. That band of animals was suddenly treating Han man that way. "You and Lin Feng know that person?" asked Wen Ao Shui to Jing Yun. Jing Yun looked sure of herself and nodded. "Yes, we do. He is our good friend." When the others heard Jing Yun, they were stupefied. No wonder Lin Feng had become so furious to the extent that some cold qi was released from his body. So that man that was made into a beast was actually Lin Feng's friend. Not only do they complain about the state of the world and show compassion for trash, but they also make friends with slaves. They are true to their names as beggars. Friends with slaves. The political students were making fun of Lin Feng and the others. They had heard what Jing Yun had said. Their friend is treated as a beast and there is even a person riding him, said the young man in yellow clothes. Lin Feng slowly turned around and looked at him. Suddenly, the young man in yellow clothes turned deathly pale. He looked terrified. He looked so cold, so heartless, thought the young man in yellow. Lin Feng's eyes were expressionless and lifeless. "Filthy beggar," said the young man in yellow clothes while gnashing his teeth. He had been momentarily scared of Lin Feng because of the expression in his eyes. How was that possible? Boom! Lin Feng crushed his seat into tiny pieces with a punch. The seats on the viewing platform were all made from solid stone. Lin Feng had crushed it with a single strike. He then started walking towards the young man in yellow. Boom! Lin Feng crushed another seat. The heart of the young man in yellow clothes started pounding. At that moment, Lin Feng arrived in front of him. Lin Feng grabbed the young man's throat. His movement had been as fast as lightning, so that the young man hadn't even had the time to dodge. Lin Feng then lifted the young man's body into the air with one hand. The young man in yellow clothes could hardly breathe from the power of Lin Feng's grip. Boom! Without hesitation, Lin Feng smashed the young man's body into the stone chair that he was sitting on. The noise from his body colliding with the stone was terrifying. Then, Lin Feng pressed the young man's head onto the ground and then trampled over his face. The young man was suffocating from the pressure of Lin Feng's foot on his face. This had happened in the blink of an eye. Everybody was astonished. All these political students were watching the scene speechless. They were astonished by Lin Feng's actions. When they felt Lin Feng's cold qi, they didn't dare to attack him. "If you say one more word, I will crush you under my foot like a bug," said Lin Feng in a low voice, fixedly staring at the young man in yellow clothes under his foot. His voice was extremely cold. At that moment, the young man in yellow clothes was bleeding so much that he was half conscious and didn't really realize what was going on. His head was spinning, and he was just staring blankly into the distance. A supposed beggar has trampled all over your face. Now everybody will make fun of you just like you made fun of the slaves. The difference is that the slaves are worth much more than you," said Lin Feng coldly. He then removed his foot and ignored the young man in yellow clothes. He started walking towards the cage. With every step he took closer to the cage, the cold qi emerging from his body was getting colder and colder. Everybody was staring at Lin Feng, wondering what he was doing and why such a freezing cold qi was being released from his body. Those near Lin Feng was particularly stupefied. That young man was incredibly terrifying. What was wrong with him? Those in the cage could feel that the atmosphere was getting colder and colder. The old man was astonished when he felt the cold qi being released by Lin Feng, who was slowly walking towards the cage. Bai Zi was also stunned, especially since he had also seen the scene a moment before with the young man in yellow. Lin Feng was definitely crazy, and it wasn't a good idea to provoke insane people. Bai Zi's heart was pounding at full speed in his chest. When Po Jun saw Lin Feng and how ferocious he looked, his heart also started pounding. Lin Feng, it was Lin Feng. He had thought he would never see people he knew again. As far as Han Man was concerned, when he saw Lin Feng, he blinked a few times as if he was seeing things. The bestial expression in his eyes disappeared and was replaced with a sorrowful expression. He had been forced to live like a ferocious beast. He was forced into life and death battle constantly and could have died at any time. He had never thought he would see Lin Feng again. Han Man hated Duan Tian Lang, that animal. And he hated everybody at the prisoner arena. When all the events happened in the Yun Hai sect, Han Man and Po Jun had survived. But if Han Man had known that he would become a slave and be forced to live the way he had, he would have preferred to die back on that day. Many survivors had been taken as prisoners and then sold as slaves. That's how Han Man had been sold to the prisoner arena. During his time in the prisoner arena, Han Man had become lifeless. He was humiliated from morning to evening and beaten like a dog. He had even been forced to act as a ferocious wild beast. In the prisoner camp, he didn't stop killing his friends from the morning till the night. He had been taught that if he didn't kill, he would die; if he killed, he wouldn't die. He had become much stronger and had a savage ferocity. Han Man had resisted, and because he had tried to resist, he had been forced to live as a beast. At that moment, when he saw Lin Feng, Han Man's expression gradually changed. His eyes and face gradually turned red. Tears slowly started flowing down from his eyes. "Lin Feng, my brother," said Han Man as he hung his head in shame. He was ashamed to be in this situation where he was riding like a beast and Lin Feng was, once again, rushing into a powerful foe to save him. Han Man knew what kind of person Lin Feng was. He had gone to the precipice of the abyss to save him. He had gone into the life and death arena to save him, and once again he was moving into danger to save him. No matter whom he was facing, Lin Feng would never let his friends down, even if the opponent was incredibly strong. There is no one that he would not challenge for the sake of his friends. His life was worth nothing if he abandoned his friends. And at that moment, Lin Feng was risking his life again for his friends. "Brother, you have suffered hardships." Lin Feng's dark and cold expression suddenly changed and was replaced with a warm smile. Han Man raised his head again when he heard Lin Feng. Tears were unceasingly flowing down his cheeks. There are some friends who will come to save you no matter how dark the situation becomes. End of chapter 143. Chapter 144, Killing Shadow. "Brother?" The old man was surprised when he heard the conversation between them. An evil expression appeared on his face. Lin Feng surprisingly knew that slave and was a good friend of his. The old man looked at Lin Feng, who was slowly moving towards them. He then walked towards Lin Feng to prevent him from walking further and said, "It doesn't matter if you were friends before. Now, he is marked. He is doomed to be a slave for the rest of his life. If I put a mark on your face, will you become a slave too?" said Lin Feng extremely coldly. The old man smiled and said, "You want to die, right? If I die, it will mean that someone killed me after your death," said Lin Feng coldly. Suddenly, the qi emerging from his body grew even colder and started moving towards the old man. "You are overestimating yourself," said the old man while smiling. Suddenly, his body pierced through the air looking like a hurricane and moved towards Lin Feng. Sword unsheathing. Lin Feng used his sword unsheathing skill. He had mastered it to perfection. He was extremely quick and agile since a single strike needed to be enough to kill an opponent. But the old man ignored Lin Feng's attack and managed to avoid it while moving closer to him. He then thrust his fist and punched Lin Feng in the chest. Blood sprayed from Lin Feng's mouth as he was propelled backwards. 7th Qi layer. The crowd was stupefied. The old man was incredibly strong. He had broken through to the 7th Qi layer, and compared to Lin Feng the difference was too big. Lin Feng wouldn't be able to withstand another attack. But Lin Feng raised his head again. He started moving towards the old man again. He looked as cold and determined as ever. The entire atmosphere around the cage was filled with a freezing cold qi. You're very talented. You could have had a brilliant future, but because you're courting death, I have no other option but to help you find it, said the old man when he saw that Lin Feng continued to approach. He then laughed coldly and said, "You have only broken through to the 4th Ling Qi layer. You could never touch me, not even once, and killing me? Only in your dreams. No need to kill him. Put a mark on him. Make him a slave. Wouldn't it be much better that way?" said Bai Zi. The old man was surprised by those words but then smiled and said, "Young master, you are extremely clever. Of course, that would be a much better solution. He's much stronger than that Han beast. It would probably be a great spectacle to see him fighting as a slave." "Let's do it," said Bai Zi while evilly staring at Lin Feng. Lin Feng had acted recklessly, there was no choice. Lin Feng didn't even give him a glance though. He kept walking. Each and every step he took was filled with determination and coldness. Han Man roared just like an animal. His body was shaking, but the middle-aged man was holding him down with chains. Han Man couldn't move freely. The old man hit Lin Feng again. Blood splashed once again from his mouth. Lin Feng's body was projected away and struck against the wall of the cage so hard that it made the cage vibrate. Just like the old man had said, Lin Feng was strong but had only broken through to the 4th Ling Qi layer. He could never compete with someone of the 7th Ling Qi layer. When Lu Fei and the others saw Lin Feng's body get blown away, they all stood up and walked towards the cage. Wait, said Wen Ao Shui, preventing them from moving further. "Get out of the way," said Lu Fei. Wen Ao Shui only had a wry smile on his face. "Lin Feng cannot win this fight. If you go there, you will only die with him. Get out of the way," said Lu Fei coldly, ignoring what he had just said. "I'm going," said Wen Ao Shui while shaking his head. His body suddenly transformed into an illusion and flew towards the cage. When he arrived at the edge of the cage, he didn't enter it. He had the feeling that Lin Feng wouldn't be so easy to kill. Wen Ao Shui was terribly touched by Lin Feng's actions. That guy would risk his life for his friends. Po Jun was touched as well. The mark on his face was moving along with his facial muscles. Such a person should be respected by everyone. Lin Feng's eyes became pitch black. He was slowly walking forwards. In his heart, there was no emotion at all, only darkness. "Die!" shouted Lin Feng furiously. His deadly sword fluttered in the air. A grayish-black fog rose around his sword and started rushing into the atmosphere. "Is it the best you can do?" said the old man while laughing. He joined his hands together and released a hurricane-like wind. A deadly qi unceasingly flowed out from his body. Lin Feng's sword was shaking with intensity. At that moment, Lin Feng threw his sword through the air towards the old man. It pierced through atmosphere at full speed and lacerated everything which came into contact with it. "What's the point?" said the old man fearlessly. When Lin Feng's sword arrived in front of the old man, it abruptly stopped. "Goodbye," yelled the old man, causing Lin Feng's long sword fly away into the distance. At that moment, Lin Feng had landed in front of the old man and thrust his hand forward with the sharpness and precision of a sword. "Die," said the old man with a cold smile on the corner of his mouth. He disintegrated Lin Feng's sword qi and punched Lin Feng again. Thick dark blood gushed out from Lin Feng's mouth. Lin Feng, however, had caught the old man's hand using both his hands. He surprisingly hadn't been pushed back. Everybody was stupefied. What is he doing? Lin Feng was probably going to die because of this. That action was a big mistake. It seemed like there was a large wound on Lin Feng's chest where the old man unceasingly punched. There was a huge blood stain. The scene was terrifying. But Lin Feng didn't release the old man's hand. He was firmly and tightly holding it between his two hands. Everybody was staring at Lin Feng. How fierce. These were probably his last moments and he still didn't release the old man's hand. Had he renounced his will to live? Some of Lin Feng's blood even splashed on Han Man. His heart was pounding, and he was breathing heavily. Dust rose under Han Man's body. Suddenly, the ground started shaking. The expression in his eyes was progressively changing. His red eyes slowly turned yellowish-brown and looked like that of a bloodthirsty wild beast. They were filled with intense wrath. A bestial roar came from Han Man's mouth. It seemed like the ground was going to cave in. The ground was shaking so much that it seemed like it could cave it at any time. More and more yellow dust was rising into the air. A thick layer of sand was covering Han Man's body. The middle-aged man who was on Han Man's back wondered what was happening. His heart started beating faster and faster. What's going on? When the middle-aged man saw all the dust flying around him, he was astonished. Suddenly, the chains on Han Man's body broke into 1,000 tiny pieces. When the old man and Lin Feng, who were fighting, saw that, they were stupefied too. The old man was surprised. He didn't understand what was happening. His pupils shrank. Celestial spirit. Suddenly, a dazzling light as bright as the sun burst from Lin Feng's expressionless and pitch-black eyes. Since Lin Feng's celestial spirit had awoken, he had not taken advantage of the abilities that his spirit provided him. This was the first time. The old man slightly closed his eyes. He wanted to move back, but Lin Feng was still tightly holding his hand. Suddenly, the old man jumped up in the air, taking Lin Feng along with him. Die, said Lin Feng in a low voice. He could see everything clearly thanks to his celestial spirit. Every movement of the old man was very clear in Lin Feng's mind. At the same time, Lin Feng's body turned into a shadow. A dazzling light appeared and suddenly, a long trail of blood sprayed into the air. That shadow. The crowd was stupefied by what they had seen. Lin Feng had become almost invisible with his shadow. Just because you're extremely strong, it doesn't mean that I can't kill you, said a cold yet calm voice. The old man was holding his throat as blood was gushing through his fingers. He was falling slowly to the ground. End of chapter 144. Chapter 145, Blood Vessels. The old man's body collapsed. He was lying dead on the ground with a shocked expression still on his face. At that moment, the entire atmosphere became calm again. Lin Feng, who had only broken through to the 4th Ling Qi layer, had killed the old man who had broken through to the 7th Ling Qi layer? In that world, 1 Ling Qi layer was already a huge difference in battle. A cultivator who could defeat people with higher Qi layers than his own was a real genius. The whole crowd had the impression that they were in a dream. It had looked like it was the end for Lin Feng, but the final result was strangely the exact opposite of what everyone was thinking. The crowd was stunned. Lin Feng had been determined until the end and shocked the entire crowd. Quick, ruthless, agile, skillful and determined, the crowd admired Lin Feng as a cultivator. His strategy had been amazing. He had planned everything that happened from the beginning. At the start of the fight, he was not even using a fraction of his true speed. He wanted to hide how fast he really was, and then at the end, he had carried out an extremely quick and lethal attack. Lin Feng coughed loudly. Blood revealed itself with each cough. There was also a large amount of blood flowing out from the wound on his chest. He took out a jar of pills from his pocket. Lin Feng took 2 pills out and quickly swallowed them. Suddenly, he started feeling more and more relaxed. This guy is insane, said Wen Ao Shui while looking at Lin Feng. He had a smile on his face. Lin Feng was hard to understand. What he had done seemed like a miracle. He had surprisingly managed to kill the old man. 7th Qi layer, thought Wen Ao Shui. Besides, where did that other sword come from? Lin Feng had gotten rid of his long sword during the battle, and nobody had noticed that he still had another sword. He had used that sword to slit the old man's throat. Lin Feng, brother, said Han Man. At that moment, one of his pupils was a deep red and the other one was brown. It was extremely strange to see. One eye looked like it had been bathed in blood and the other looked like the depth of the earth. Don't worry. I don't die so easily, said Lin Feng, whose cold expression turned into a warm and friendly smile when looking at Han Man. Han Man roared again while looking at the sky. The ground started shaking. Yellow sand started flying around Han Man's body. Suddenly, his entire body transformed into a sandstorm. What's going on? Asked some people in the crowd. That was so strange. A moment ago, the crowd hadn't really paid attention to him because they were too fascinated by the fight between Lin Feng and the old man, but they had noticed that something abnormal was happening to him. They were all speechless. The sand flying around Han Man's body was getting thicker and thicker. As the sand grew denser, the light grew more dazzling and brighter. At that moment, there was so much sand flying around Han Man that it had created a huge dome of sand. Han Man was surrounded by a gigantic sand sphere. Lin Feng frowned. He didn't understand what was happening to Han Man. Crack. A large crack appeared in the gigantic sphere surrounding Han Man's body. It was as large as a lotus flower. Han Man's body could be seen once again. Everybody's eyes shrank. They were all stupefied and looked incredibly perplexed. Han Man's hair was very long and its color was pitch black, but at this moment, his hair had turned yellow like sand. The sight of him made people in the crowd start to shiver. Han Man looked incredibly majestic at that moment, like an ancient god. The only thing which hadn't changed was the slave mark he had on his face. Han Man opened his eyes. It seemed like there was a storm growing inside his eyes. From head to foot, Han Man was filled with explosive force and power. Han Man turned around and looked at the middle-aged man with a vicious gaze. The middle-aged man was scared by Han Man's strange bestial look. "Die!" shouted Han Man. He started walking slowly, but his steps were extremely heavy on the ground. He stopped in place and threw a punch towards the middle-aged man. Yellow sand was glowing all around his fist. The middle-aged man was surprised by the attack. He didn't have time to dodge the attack, so he raised his fist and a strong power emerged. Boom! When their two fists collided, a huge cloud of sand rose up in the air, but suddenly, a huge quantity of sand moved towards the middle-aged man at full speed and buried his body in a solid tomb of sand. Han Man sounded furious. He punched the sand in which the middle-aged man was buried with such power that it cracked open. The body of the middle-aged man was crushed and his body had exploded at the point of impact. However, there was no blood to be seen, only sand surrounded the body. What? The whole crowd was gasping with astonishment. They were staring at Han Man. His attack was incredibly violent. Not only had he trapped the middle-aged man and buried him alive, but he then also stuck with such power that part of his body exploded. The crowd didn't have the slightest impression that Han Man was any weaker than Lin Feng. "His blood vessels have awoken," whispered Wen Ao Shui blankly, staring at Han Man through the cage. That's right. Han Man's blood vessels had awoken. Only when the blood circulation had reached a perfect rhythm, the blood vessels could awaken and grant the blood a special power. If someone's blood vessels awoke, their offspring would also be granted the same power. When blood vessels awoke, it provided cultivators with an amazing strength which was previously hidden. However, usually the cultivators who had awoken their blood vessels would have a blood spirit. What Han Man had achieved was a miracle to the extent that Wen Ao Shui had never even heard that it was possible. However, there was no possible doubt, Han Man's vessels had awoken. There was no other possible explanation for the strange transformation that had happened to his body. Lin Feng was also dumbstruck. How strong? At that moment, Han Man had the strength of the 5th Ling Qi layer, which meant he was even stronger than Lin Feng, who was only at the 4th Ling Qi layer. At that moment, many people moved towards the cage. Lin Feng was surprised. "Lin Feng, brother, that little brat should make his grave here," said Han Man while glancing at Bai Zi. He wanted to make Lin Feng a slave a moment before. Bai Zi had nowhere to run. Han Man started walking towards Bai Zi and raised his fist into the air. Lin Feng slowly turned around and looked at Bai Zi. At that moment, Bai Zi's face turned deathly pale, and he started retreating backwards. "You said that you wanted to make me a slave, right?" said Lin Feng while walking towards Bai Zi. When Bai Zi heard Lin Feng, he started shaking with terror and shook his head. Come save me, shouted Bai Zi. How could it end like this? This place belonged to his clan. If he wanted something, then he could get it, but at that moment, the situation was critical for him and he had no way to escape. At that moment, many people were moving towards the cage in an attempt to help Bai Zi. They were all stopping close to Wen Ao Shui, who was blocking the entrance of the cage. Wen Ao Shui was just leaning against the entrance of cage. He had a cynical smile on his face. When Bai Zi saw that he wasn't moving, he shouted, "Wen Ao Shui! You dare!" Wen Ao Shui was provoking the young master of the Bai clan. End of chapter 145. You are listening to Peerless Martial God audio on light novel Aloud. Chapter 146. Marking. What are you guys doing? Shouted Bai Zi furiously when he saw that people had stopped at the entrance of the cage. Wen Ao Shui glanced at Bai Zi. Wen Ao Shui found it pathetic that Bai Zi was in such a situation because of his own stupidity. Bai Zi thought that he was a genius who had all the power in the world, and because of that he had put himself in that dangerous situation. "If I'm here, nobody will enter the cage," said Wen Ao Shui in a cold tone while sounding very confident. Lin Feng was surprised. He hadn't thought that Wen Ao Shui would act so cruel. It seemed like that young man, who was as beautiful as a woman, was actually not easy to predict. Bai Zi was staring at Lin Feng and saw that he wasn't hurrying to kill him. Lin Feng raised his sword and slowly started walking towards Bai Zi. "What are you going to do to me?" said Bai Zi, who could barely breathe as fear was starting to consume his consciousness. His voice was very low. Don't worry. I will not kill you, said Lin Feng indifferently. Bai Zi was surprised. Immediately after, a smile appeared on the corner of Lin Feng's mouth, who said, Your clan likes to put markings on people's faces and make them become slaves for the rest of their lives. I will also put a marking in your face. We will see if you ever dare to insult and humiliate slaves again. Put a marking on his face? Like a slave? Haven't you heard what I said? Come in and help me, shouted Bai Zi furiously as he was getting more and more impatient. Some people moved to enter the cage, then suddenly, Wen Ao Shui jumped over in front of them and said, 3 more steps and I will unsheathe my sword. If I am forced to unsheathe my sword, there will be blood, said Wen Ao Shui calmly. Everybody stopped moving towards the cage. Nobody dared to take another step forward. Evil must be annihilated. A gigantic amount of sword qi was released from Lin Feng's body. Bai Zi was incredibly frightened. He was not going to be saved by anyone as they were all outside, afraid to move another step. If you let me off, I can offer you a fortune of purity stones. I can even offer you some high-class martial skills and agility techniques. Offer? Lin Feng laughed. Wealthy people were really used to getting their own way with their money and influence. They thought that everyone was beneath them and could be bought with a few purity stones. If I let you off, you will give me some purity stones, high-class martial skills and agility techniques, said Lin Feng coldly before adding, Do you think that I'm stupid? After what had happened today, the Bai clan would never forget Lin Feng. They would never let him off so easily. If Lin Feng didn't act, then he would never be able to avenge Han Man and his other friends from the Yunhai sect who had been transformed into fighting slaves and whose faces had been violated with a marking in the prisoner arena. Lin Feng and the Bai clan were enemies. He had to kill them, or they would kill him. There would be no peace between them as long as he lived. Lin Feng thought this way because he was now the patriarch of the Yunhai sect. Bai Zi made a hideous and evil expression when he heard Lin Feng's words. If you dare to touch me, the Bai clan will never let you off and they will hunt you until you are dead. As expected, you're a moron, said Lin Feng, who couldn't bear listening to Bai Zi talk. At that moment, Bai Zi let out a horrible shriek. A marking had appeared on Bai Zi's face. Bai Zi covered his face with his hand and blood was unceasingly flowing through his fingers. Lin Feng looked incredibly cold and ruthless. He was completely emotionless. He didn't feel the slightest bit of compassion or pity after seeing Bai Zi in such a pitiful state. With people like him, this was the most efficient means to solve the problem. Only violence would be understood. Lin Feng used his sword to carve a slave marking into Bai Zi's face, but it was quickly covered by blood. With another slash of his sword, he removed one of Bai Zi's fingers. Bai Zi was shaking with fear and pain, then suddenly, he collapsed. What a cruel yet determined young man, thought many people in the crowd. They remained silent and were fixedly staring at the people in the cage of the prisoner arena. On that day, the crowd had seen a magnificent show. They had seen spectacular fights and something they never expected. Lin Feng looked as calm and emotionless as before. He was still holding his sword in his hand. He turned around and said in a low voice, Let's go. Han Man and Po Jun walked along with Lin Feng. Wen Ao Shui started walking back as well. At that moment, all of those who had come near the cage to help Bai Zi quickly rushed forwards to help him. Those who dare to provoke me, die, said Wen Ao Shui in an extremely cold voice. Lin Feng was walking behind him, and blood was still dripping from his sword. Lin Feng's sword had frightened everyone. Han Man was walking behind them. Each of his steps made the ground vibrate. Everybody already understood how strong he was. These people knew that if they didn't block them from leaving, they would not lose their life meaninglessly. A short moment later, the crowd could only see the backs of Lin Feng and his friends. When they had seen Lin Feng go down into the cage, they didn't know what he intended to do. They also hadn't thought that he would kill the old man who was at the 7th Ling Qi lair. Piece of trash. You're just a piece of trash. A furious voice spread through the atmosphere of the prisoner arena after Lin Feng and his friends had left. It was the young man in yellow clothes who was furious. On that day, he had been humiliated by Lin Feng. How could this happen? His family name was Yu. They had never been humiliated. Who within their right mind would dare to humiliate the Yu clan? When the Bai clan members saw the young man in yellow clothes stand up, they were surprised. If someone dares talk about what happened today, I will kill him, said the young man in yellow clothes to those sitting next to him. They were surprised, but they obediently listened and nodded with agreement. Inside of their hearts, they were insulting him though. He had provoked Lin Feng, he had made Bai Zi pay the price for it, and on top of that, he was asking them not to tell this to anyone. He was just scared that he would lose face and make the entire Yu clan lose face. Lin Feng, if you don't die, I'll never regain my prestige. A moment ago, he hadn't dared talk in the presence of Lin Feng because he had been scared that Lin Feng would also punish him. Lin Feng was too frightening. He had seen how Lin Feng had carved a marking onto Bai Zi. How horrible. Lin Feng had been truly ruthless when he was at the prisoner arena. Lin Feng was in his room lying on the bed. Suddenly, he had the feeling that a hand was almost touching his forehead. Lin Feng shook his head, stretched and slowly opened his eyes. A beautiful silhouette was standing in front of him. At that moment, Meng Qing was looking emotionless. She looked at Lin Feng and said calmly, "You woke up." Lin Feng's body was sore and felt rigid from head to toe after fighting with the old man, but his vital organs were still functioning properly. "You stayed here all the time to look after me?" asked Lin Feng to Meng Qing. Meng Qing shook her head and said, "No, only once in a while." "Really?" asked Lin Feng, not convinced. "Of course, why?" replied Meng Qing. Lin Feng was surprised and then laughed. The door suddenly opened with a loud rumble. Lu Fei entered the room. Meng Qing stood up and said, "He woke up, you can go and talk to him." When she finished talking, Meng Qing immediately left. Lu Fei had a strange expression and looked perplexed. Meng Qing hadn't left Lin Feng alone for even 1 second when he was sleeping. Why did she hastily leave when he woke up? "All right," said Lu Fei while nodding, even though she didn't really understand. She walked towards Lin Feng's bed and angrily looked at him, which surprised Lin Feng. He had just woken up. Why would Lu Fei already be angry with him? What did he do? Why do you act so recklessly? Do you never think about the consequences? Asked Lu Fei. She was obviously angry because of what had happened at the prisoner arena. Lin Feng smiled wryly and thought, consequences? When he saw that his friends of the Yun Hai sect had become slaves and had been marked like animals after the destruction of the sect, how could he not act? For a beautiful and delicate face like yours, I will also act recklessly and ignore the consequences, said Lin Feng jokingly while laughing. When Lin Feng had finished talking, Lu Fei's heart started racing in her chest and her face completely turned red. It was both beautiful and delicate. End of chapter 146. Chapter 147. The Visitors. Outside of the academy, a certain number of people were walking towards its main gate. Their leader was wearing blue clothes and magnificent mask. He was a middle-aged man and a cold chi emerged from his body. Amongst the people who were following him there were some Bai clan members who had witnessed all the events at the prisoner arena. Amongst the people of the Bai clan was one certain young man. He was wearing a splendid golden mask. His hand was wrapped in bandages. The expression in his eyes looked like a demon coming straight from the underworld. His eyes under his golden mask looked unimaginably evil. At that moment, 2 silhouettes jumped in front of them and blocked them the way. They then shouted, "Except for the students and the staff members of the Celestial Academy, nobody can enter the territory the Celestial Academy." The middle-aged man in blue clothes took a few steps forward, his hair was fluttering in the wind. "Get lost," said the man in blue clothes. He then made a single movement and the 2 people who were obstructing the way were blown away in the blink of an eye. People who saw the scene were gasping with astonishment. Zan Qi Layer. Surprisingly, a cultivator of the Zan Qi Layer had come to the academy. The group of people entered the academy. The 2 guards stood up and started walking. That middle-aged man of the Zan Qi Layer was surely here with ill intentions. The man in blue clothes and the large group of Bai clan members who were following him arrived in front of one of the palaces. This was the palace where the military students lived. Stop. Suddenly a large group of people moved in front of the group of people. The middle-aged man in blue clothes frowned and said, "Get the hell out of my way." "Who the hell do you think you are? Do you not know the rules of the academy?" coldly said one of the men blocking the way. The man in blue clothes glanced at him and said, "Please bring out someone who knows how to speak." "What do you want? Why did you come to my academy?" coldly said a man in black robes at that moment. He was slowly walking towards the man in blue clothes. "I want you to hand over some people to us," said the man in blue clothes indifferently. "Hand over some people?" said the man in black robes with a cold smile on his face and then added, "Not only did you break the rules of my academy, but you also dare come and ask me to hand over some of my students?" The man in blue clothes smiled coldly. He raised his hand and at that moment, the palm of his hand started emitting a radiant light. When the man in black robe saw the light within the middle-aged man's palm, his expression drastically changed. You say that outsiders cannot come into the territory of the Celestial Academy, but then I would like to ask you something. How can you allow your members to visit my prisoner arena and then allow them to kill some of my staff members while kidnapping 2 of my slaves? Can you explain this to me? Said the man in blue clothes. His voice sounded extremely strict, and it was clear how powerful he was from his tone. Force was constantly emerging from his body. If you don't hand over those who caused the trouble as well as my 2 slaves, I will get very angry. The man in black robes looked terribly annoyed when he heard what the man had said. He was a teacher at the academy, which was an extremely high status, but he knew that he couldn't keep the man in blue clothes under control. Those who were with him would also be hard to defeat. Who caused the trouble? Asked the man wearing the black robes. Some of your military students, Lin Feng, Wenao Shui. The man in black robes was stupefied. The man in blue clothes added, the one mainly responsible for the whole thing is Lin Feng though. You don't need to hand over Wenao Shui but Lin Feng and my 2 slaves, you must hand them over to me this instant. Said the man in blue clothes in an extremely powerful voice while showing lenience towards Wenao Shui. The middle-aged man in blue clothes had a very high status and he knew that he couldn't insist on punishing Wenao Shui. The academy would never hand him over. Go inside, tell Lin Feng and the 2 slaves to come out here. Said the man in black robes to 2 other people who were standing at his side. The man in blue clothes seemed satisfied. The one who was standing behind him wearing a golden mask had an incredibly evil light flash through his eyes. Lin Feng was meditating in his room and suddenly, the door emitted a loud noise which made him open his eyes. Lin Feng, come out! Shouted a voice. Lin Feng was surprised. That person was so rude. The academy had rules, nobody was able to enter in the living quarters of a student without his permission. But at that moment, somebody opened his door and told him to come out. Not only was that a violation of the rules but it was also a humiliation. Lin Feng stood up and stretched. He felt better but he hadn't entirely recovered from his injuries. Lin Feng looked at the guy who had called him. He was also a student of the academy. So, you are Lin Feng? Said the one who had come inside with an indifferent tone. What's wrong? Asked Lin Feng while frowning. What a moron. He thinks that he can act recklessly because he is Wenao Shui's friend. He first provoked He Mo and then went to the prisoner arena and caused trouble. Thought the students. The first time when Lin Feng had provoked He Mo, Wenao Shui was with him. He had then caused trouble at the prisoner arena with Wenao Shui, so they thought that Lin Feng acted this way only because he thought that Wenao Shui could indefinitely protect him. They thought that he was like a dog using his master's power to cause trouble. Now, bring the 2 slaves you kidnapped from the prisoner arena. Some people have come to see you, said the student. When he finished talking, he turned around and started leaving. Wait, said Lin Feng. The student immediately stopped and asked, what's wrong? Lin Feng coldly said, didn't you forget something? The student replied, forgot what? He then shrugged and said, no, I haven't forgot anything. You did, said Lin Feng firmly. The student seemed angry and said, are you playing around with me? I don't have time to joke. You rushed into my room and behaved in a rude way. You could at least make an apology. Said Lin Feng while smiling coldly. Apologize? Said the student who smiled as if he found the situation funny. He then ignored Lin Feng, turned around and started leaving. At that moment, a freezing cold chi crashed into his body and oppressed him. He was surprised and stopped moving. He turned around and saw Lin Feng who was slowly walking towards him. Lin Feng's body was releasing a piercingly cold chi. What are you doing? Said the student with a shocked expression. You're only this strong and act with such disrespect. I don't like that impolite behavior. Said Lin Feng while continuing to walk forward. The chi released from his body was getting more and more intense. The student was stupefied and was getting more frightened. He couldn't compete with Lin Feng in terms of strength. I came in the name of the teacher. Just come with me, said the student. Of course, I will come with you, but you violated the rules of the academy and acted rude to me while inside my home. If that's how you plan to convince me to come with you, then you have failed. Do you think disrespecting me will make me obediently come with you? Wouldn't all the others laugh at me for allowing you to act as you please in my home? When saying these words, an even colder chi was released from Lin Feng's body. Everything around him had started freezing. The student was frightened. He only saw Lin Feng raise his fist and saw a ball of frost appearing around it. He then punched towards the student. Oh, shouted the student. He immediately raised his fist and punched towards Lin Feng. The chi of his attack emitted a rumbling noise in the air as it crashed through the atmosphere. When his fist and Lin Feng's fist collided, the student suddenly felt an acute pain within his hand. "Get out now," said Lin Feng while kicking him with incredible force. At that moment, the student was sent tumbling outside and his body was covered by a layer of ice. "Piece of trash of the third Ling Qi layer acting so arrogant when in my living quarters," shouted Lin Feng. He then said, "Wait for me patiently outside. If you enter my living quarters again, then I'll cripple your cultivation." End of chapter 147. Chapter 148, The Furious Teacher. The student remained motionless. At that moment, he felt extremely ashamed, especially the people who were passing outside Lin Feng's living quarters at the time had seen him being humiliated. He had thought that he could behave rudely because the teacher had sent him, but in the end, he was humiliated and forced to wait outside. Lin Feng already knew that the student had come because of the issue at the prisoner arena. Lin Feng knew that sooner or later, the people from the prisoner arena would come to look for him. Lin Feng went back into his room and put on his Chong Pao, and then he moved towards the door. The noise of a door being opened spread to Lin Feng's ears. Wait, said a cold and indifferent voice. It was Meng Qing who had opened the door. "What's wrong?" said Lin Feng while turning around. Meng Qing had already put on her fine veil which was covering her face. She was slowly walking towards him. "I should always be with you when you go outside," said Meng Qing, which made Lin Feng smile wryly, but he had a warmth fill his heart. "All right," said Lin Feng while nodding. She was worried about his safety, but she would never say it. They both left the living quarters and closed the door behind them. The student looked at Lin Feng and Meng Qing and said, "What about the two slaves?" "Bring us outside," said Lin Feng with such a strict tone that the student didn't dare say anything back. On the way, everybody was pointing at the student while laughing, which made him feel more and more ashamed. At that moment, there was a multitude of people who had gathered outside of the palace. The middle-aged man in blue clothes was standing before a group of people while looking majestic. He came. Lin Feng came. At that moment, the crowd saw Lin Feng slowly come out from inside the palace. Next to Lin Feng was a gorgeous young girl. Even though she looked graceful, delicate and innocent, a strange qi was emerging from her beautiful body. However, two people were missing. The two slaves weren't there at all. The teacher in black robes looked at the student he had sent to look for Lin Feng and asked him, "What's going on?" The student scratched his head and didn't dare to reply. "Piece of trash. Not capable of doing a simple thing," said the teacher in black robes. He then looked at Lin Feng and asked, "Did you cause trouble at the prisoner arena and then kidnap two slaves and bring them into the academy?" "I did cause trouble at the prisoner arena, but I didn't kidnap two slaves, I only brought back my two friends," said Lin Feng while looking at the teacher in black robes. Only because he had said the word slave, Lin Feng felt disgusted. "Slaves are slaves, and they are your friends? How am I supposed to allow slaves to enter into the academy?" said the teacher in black clothes coldly, not caring about Lin Feng's face. "Well then, teacher, I would like to ask you about what makes a person a slave? What does it mean to be a slave?" "A slave is someone who had been marked as someone's property. Because they are marked, they are forever a slave," replied the teacher. "Well then, teacher, I have another question for you. There is a slave in front of you now. How come you have let him into the academy?" said Lin Feng coldly. The crowd was surprised. Lin Feng was really audacious to talk that way to the teacher. The teacher in black robes was perplexed and asked Lin Feng, "Where do you see a slave?" Lin Feng smiled and pointed at the golden masked person standing behind the man in blue clothes. He then said, "Make him take off his mask and you will find a slave." The golden masked young man was Bai Zi. How could Lin Feng not recognize him? "I see that this is how the Celestial Academy works, people are not respected, and students are not taught discipline," said the man in blue clothes. The teacher in black robes suddenly had an ice-cold expression on his face. How could Lin Feng make him lose face? "I told you to bring out the two slaves, did you not hear me?" said the teacher in black robes while fixedly staring at Lin Feng. A strong qi was emerging from his body. He looked extremely strict. Lin Feng was surprised and then smiled. Having such teachers is a disgrace for the Celestial Academy. These people come and cause trouble, yet the only people you blame are your own students. You make all the members of the academy lose face. If you dare to try and punish me, it will affect the reputation of our academy and it will mean that you are nothing more than the Bai clan's little dog," said Lin Feng coldly. A strong qi emerged from the teacher in black robes. The entire atmosphere was filled with a deadly qi. How could Lin Feng dare to humiliate him in front of so many people? Did he want to die? Do you want to die? Furiously shouted the teacher. Die? I don't want to die this young, replied Lin Feng coldly. He immediately took out a card from his pocket. Everybody was surprised. I don't have to respect the rules of the Celestial Academy because on the registration day when I came here, I already met a teacher who was a real bastard, but when I met the vice principal, he was nice enough to invite me to enjoy all the benefits of the academy without any obligations. He also said that I could bring anyone to the academy. On that day, I wouldn't have thought that I would meet such a crappy teacher so soon. It is rare to find someone who would act like the little lapdog for outsiders. You are a great humiliation for the Celestial Academy and all of its members, said Lin Feng coldly. The whole crowd was stupefied. The vice principal himself had invited Lin Feng to join the academy without having any obligations. No wonder he brought people in without any restrictions. The teacher in black robes was astonished. That card was really a privilege card delivered by the vice principal himself. He just humiliated me. How can I regain my face now? Nobody will ever respect me again, thought the teacher in black robes. The expression in his eyes was incredibly sharp. It is the first time that I have heard that someone can obtain a privilege card without being a student at the academy, said teacher. He then shouted, How audacious, Lin Feng. You dared steal that card from the vice principal. Today, I will deliver your punishment on behalf of the vice principal. Steal? Lin Feng was astonished. He even saw that the crowd was nodding, showing that they believed him. Lin Feng was speechless. Are you a moron? Do you know how strong the vice principal is? How could I even steal that card from him? Lin Feng was sneering at the teacher. The teacher seemed determined to harass Lin Feng in any way possible. You're good at manipulating people, but it will not work with me. If you think that you get away that easily, then keep dreaming, said the teacher strictly. Strong force and chi were emerging from his body and he rushed straight towards Lin Feng. He had moved rapidly because he couldn't let Lin Feng continue to speak. It was unbearable for him and every sentence was making him lose face. Lin Feng was in grave danger. He had made the teacher furious from disrespecting him. At that moment, Lin Feng looked indifferent. Behind him, a graceful silhouette immediately moved in front of him. End of chapter 148. Chapter 149, Flowing Blood. When the crowd saw Meng Qing, they were all stunned. The teacher in black robes laughed. More chi was released from his body. A resplendent, bright and dazzling light flashed around his body. Stop! Shouted a voice in the distance. Everybody stopped moving. That voice deeply penetrated into people's hearts to the extent that it made their souls shake. The teacher in black robes had also stopped moving. He turned around and saw a silhouette come towards them. Vice Principal. The Vice Principal had personally come. How surprising. Vice Principal Long, said the teacher in black robes respectfully. He was no longer acting rudely. Get back, shouted the Vice Principal towards the teacher. The teacher in black robes looked incredibly embarrassed and the whole crowd was stunned. In view of the Vice Principal's behavior towards the teacher, Lin Feng must have really been personally invited by the Vice Principal. Yes, Vice Principal, said the teacher in black robes while stepping backwards. He looked extremely embarrassed at his situation. Vice Principal Long turned around and looked at Lin Feng. He warmly smiled and said, I will solve this problem myself. You can go back now. Go back? The crowd was dumbstruck. Against all expectations, the Vice Principal really did care about Lin Feng. Lin Feng had caused a problem and the Vice Principal went to solve them himself. Everybody was convinced, at that moment, that the man in blue clothes wouldn't dare to touch Lin Feng. The man in blue clothes frowned. His heart was pounding. He was wondering what Lin Feng's background really was for the Vice Principal to attach so much importance to him. The Vice Principal was humiliating everybody to protect Lin Feng. Even though the man in blue clothes didn't have a status as high as that of the Vice Principal, had the Vice Principal not thought of all the people who were accompanying him? Nobody understood why the Vice Principal was acting this way towards Lin Feng. Lin Feng was also unsure of why he was receiving such treatment. He didn't understand why the Vice Principal was always so kind to him. He didn't know anyone who belonged to the Imperial clan or any other prestigious clans. He was lost. Although in the future he would eventually come to understand why the Vice Principal was helping him. Vice Principal, I want to say something but I don't know if I should, said Lin Feng while shaking his head. Tell me, said the Vice Principal. In the academy, there are some great people but there are also horrible people who drag the rest of us down with them. Those people don't deserve to be teachers, said Lin Feng indifferently. His words were sharp and poignant. He was looking at the teacher in black robes while talking. Vice Principal, I will assume the responsibility for what I have done at the prisoner arena. I don't need anyone to help me, said Lin Feng and continued. If anyone dares to offend me again in the future, then I will not hesitate to take actions myself. That guy, how aggressive. But now it's understandable why he dares talk to the teacher that way. What a big mouth. The crowd was making various comments about Lin Feng's behavior. Even the vice principal was surprised. Lin Feng was acting very strangely. Lin Feng didn't know what all these people thought. He turned around and said to the man in blue clothes, "You want me, right?" "Indeed," said the man in blue clothes while nodding. "Since you want me and I am standing right here, what are you waiting for?" said Lin Feng in an indifferent tone. The crowd was wondering what Lin Feng meant. The man in blue clothes saw that Lin Feng was extremely confident. He had an evil smile on his face. Lin Feng could have left just like the vice principal had told him, but he didn't and instead chose to confront the people who came. The man in blue clothes would not have had the power to do anything if Lin Feng had listened to the vice principal and left. By staying here and challenging them, he definitely wanted to die. "Take him," said the man in blue clothes. At that moment, two people rushed out of the group and started moving towards Lin Feng while releasing a heavy qi. When he saw these two people approaching him, Lin Feng didn't move. He still looked calm and serene. Then, Meng Qing, who was standing in front of Lin Feng, suddenly released an extremely cold qi which moved straight towards these two people. They had the feeling that their spinal cord had frozen in place. Meng Qing raised her hand and released a terrifying cold force. Their hands immediately froze solid. Very quickly, the ice started to spread all over their body, and all of a sudden, they were completely frozen in ice and absolutely unable to move. "How strong," said the crowd, stupefied. No wonder that girl had dared obstruct the way to Lin Feng. She was extremely powerful. Zhan Qi layer. The pupils of Vice Principal Long and the man in blue clothes shrank. Lin Feng had never talked about his friends, and an extremely beautiful girl who didn't look very strong was actually this amazing. What she had done a moment before was only possible for someone of the Zhan Qi layer. The teacher in the black robes was dumbstruck. What if he had been successful in attacking Lin Feng a moment before? No wonder Lin Feng was so aggressive. Someone of the Zhan Qi layer was there to protect him at all times. How scary. The crowd was trying to understand the situation. The vice principal probably liked Lin Feng for two reasons, because he was strong and because he had a high status. It was not a secret that Lin Feng was extremely talented and powerful, otherwise how could he have such beautiful female friends? From the day I spent at the prisoner arena, I swore to myself that if I ever saw a member of the Bai clan again, then they would die, said Lin Feng with an extremely cold tone. The Bai clan members were astonished. Meng Qing, however, had understood what Lin Feng meant. Her beautiful silhouette suddenly transformed into a white lotus flower and she threw herself towards the crowd. The sky above as well as the ground below all seemed to completely freeze. All the members of the Bai clan felt extreme cold. They were all covered with layers of ice. Meng Qing slightly moved her hand and suddenly, every member of the Bai clan was pierced to the bone with the terrifying coldness. If these people had been at the Qi layer stage, that would have explained why they were so affected by Meng Qing's attack, but even some people of the Ling Qi layer were feeling the cold pierce into them. How was that possible? At that moment, the man in blue clothes couldn't stand it anymore and felt like he had to get involved. A hurricane-like attack emerged from his body and moved straight towards Meng Qing. Meng Qing, looking calm, and just raised her hand which released ice that moved straight towards the blue-clothed man's attack. Boom! An extreme coldness spread throughout the atmosphere. Suddenly, two huge blocks of ice which looked like huge diamonds shot from Meng Qing's hand. At that moment, Lin Feng grabbed onto his sword and in an instant, he arrived in front of all the Bai clan members who were frozen in place. Deadly sword. Lin Feng's deadly sword started to flash through the atmosphere over and over again. Blood sprayed everywhere and the atmosphere had become incredibly bloody. He had already killed a large number of people with his sword. Just as Lin Feng had said, if he ever saw any Bai clan members then they would have to die. Everybody was stupefied by Lin Feng's strength. These people had come to capture Lin Feng and, in the end, nothing was happening the way they had expected. Lin Feng was calm and unperturbed as he was killing all the members of the Bai clan. With each stroke of his sword more blood was filling the atmosphere and another member of the Bai clan would fall dead onto the floor. Blood was endlessly flowing from Lin Feng's sword. This is what happened when Lin Feng was angered. End of chapter 149. Chapter 150. Ice reigns over the world. At that moment, the man in blue clothes and Meng Qing were in a direct confrontation. The crowd was astonished to see that Meng Qing was much stronger than him. Even though Meng Qing's style looked very simple, each time her graceful and agile body moved, she would unleash an extremely powerful attack. Her chi was so cold that it could directly freeze the man in blue. Even though he had a hurricane spirit and was extremely quick, he couldn't avoid Meng Qing's attacks and was forced to fight with her directly. What a strong girl! Who is she? Why is she with Lin Feng? The crowd was amazed. That beautiful girl was remarkably strong. The man in blue clothes didn't look so majestic anymore. He had a hideous and evil expression on his face. He was furious. Hurricane blade! Shouted the man in blue clothes. His entire body transformed into a hurricane that was actually like a sharp blade lacerating the air as it rushed towards Meng Qing. An incredibly strong and thick chi was emerging from the hurricane. What a powerful martial skill, thought the crowd. They were not near him but could still feel the chi within his hurricane attack. The large blade-like hurricane was rushing towards Lin Feng and Meng Qing at full speed. Groaned Meng Qing. This was the first time she had made any noise. Her expression was ice cold. Her body started to release an incredibly cold chi. Heart of ice, freezing both heaven and earth. Ice reigns over the world, said Meng Qing while slowly walking towards the man in blue. Her body looked lithe and graceful. A layer of ice appeared around her body and a sharp cold invaded the entire atmosphere. Everything started to instantly freeze around Meng Qing. The hurricane blade attack froze completely in midair. The body of the man in blue clothes was progressively freezing inside the hurricane. He was frozen into a huge block of ice. Every single thing within the atmosphere was frozen solid when suddenly, the block of ice started emitting small cracking noises. Suddenly, the man in blue clothes who was trapped inside the huge block of ice transformed into a hurricane, then smashed through the ice and flew into the distance at full speed. He was looking back at Meng Qing with a hideously evil expression in his eyes. His face was covered completely with frost. Meng Qing's attack had been much too powerful. He would have died if he had stayed inside that block of ice for much longer. The man in blue clothes would have never thought that such a beautiful young girl could also be so terrifyingly powerful. How frightening! But Meng Qing ignored him and immediately moved her hand again. This time, she carried out an attack on the Bai clan members. The atmosphere around them started to grow colder and colder. Only Lin Feng didn't feel cold at all while stood amongst the group of Bai clan members. Deadly sword. Lin Feng took another step and a black fog emerged from his sword. Lin Feng once again started killing the members of the Bai clan. At that moment, red blood and white frost started to mix together in the atmosphere. The middle-aged man in blue clothes was enraged when he saw Lin Feng killing the members of the Bai clan so mercilessly, but because of Meng Qing's strength, he didn't dare to move closer to them. She was a really terrifying existence. Lin Feng's sword didn't stop glowing in the middle of that bloodbath as he continued to cut down Bai clan members one after the other. Very quickly, all the members of the Bai clan were lying dead on the ground. Only one person was remaining within the group. He was wearing a golden mask and he was shaking from head to toe. This person was obviously Bai Zi. Under his golden mask, his eyes didn't express anything like hatred or cruelty anymore. The only thing that was remaining inside his eyes was pure fear. All of the strong cultivators that joined him from the Bai clan were now lying dead at his feet in a pool of their own blood, and the man in blue clothes could do nothing but watch them get slaughtered one by one before his eyes. Lin Feng raised his long sword. Blood was dripping endlessly from the tip of his sword as he slowly walked towards Bai Zi. At that moment, Bai Zi fell down onto his knees. His legs were shaking too much from fear. He hated Lin Feng from the bottom of his heart. He knew that he was about to die. Last time, I didn't kill you. Haven't I already shown you enough mercy? Said Lin Feng indifferently. Lin Feng's bloody sword was moving closer and closer to Bai Zi, who was shaking his head as if he was trying to wake himself from this nightmare. He was hastily crawling backwards while looking at Lin Feng. Last time, you said that you would make me a slave. You have not stopped attempting to take my life and continued to provoke me to no end. Now that you are in front of me, why don't you try to kill me, like always? Continued Lin Feng. There are some paths in which you shouldn't walk. You have chosen the path to the afterlife, so I will help you achieve your aim. His sword glowed once again and Bai Zi's blood sprayed into the air. Bai Zi fell heavily onto the ground. He was no longer in the world of the living. Lin Feng raised his head and looked at the middle-aged man in blue clothes who was still in the distance. He then said coldly, "If you do not have the courage to come over here, then get lost. There is no need to stay here and lose face. You will regret everything that you have done today, said the man in blue clothes with an evil glare. No need to keep saying idle threats. You came here today to kill me, so I killed all of the people that came to take my life. Next time, you will come back with even more people to try to kill me, and then what? Even more people will be lying dead on the floor beneath my feet, said Lin Feng with an indifferent tone. He then continued, if you wanted to keep your face, then you should have left earlier. You only made things worse by staying here. You have humiliated yourself. Everybody saw that you are incredibly foolish. Remember each of my words as I say them to you now. I will kill every single member of the Bai clan that stands before me without mercy. The Bai clan has no future. I will annihilate the entire Bai clan. Lin Feng's words stupefied the crowd. He was completely ruthless. He was planning to kill every Bai clan member until the total annihilation of the clan. Nobody had doubts when it came to what Lin Feng had just said. He had just proved it to everyone with his actions. There was a mass of bodies lying beneath his feet in a pool of blood which belonged to members of the Bai clan. Offending Lin Feng resulted in death. What a pity for those who offended him. I will remember your words, said the middle-aged man in blue clothes while looking evil. He slowly turned around and started walking away. He suddenly transformed into a hurricane, turned around and threw himself towards Lin Feng at full speed. He was extremely quick. Lin Feng was surprised. He could already feel the man's qi on his body. Lin Feng tried to dodge, but he could not avoid being wounded. Blood was flowing down Lin Feng's face. I will definitely kill you at some point, said the man in blue clothes, and then turned around and started leaving. The crowd didn't realize what was happening. You want to die? Shouted a cold and furious voice. It seemed like time had stopped. It was Meng Qing. An extremely cold qi emerged from her body and she immediately disappeared from everybody's view. At that moment, the man in blue clothes who was leaving suddenly stopped. He looked terrified. An extremely cold qi had suddenly appeared next to him. He then moved again at full speed in an attempt to escape. The only thing left in his mind was to run away. Heart of ice. White ice shot from Meng Qing's body and moved straight towards the man in blue clothes. He suddenly had the feeling his internal organs were starting to freeze. Blood started to flow from his mouth, but it was frozen solid. His internal organs had taken a large amount of damage. He couldn't defeat her, so all he could do was escape. He just wanted to escape with his life. This girl was much too powerful. End of chapter 150. Hope you guys enjoy the chapters, and a thumbs up is appreciated.